Tēnā koutou I tēnei pō, nā mi nui kia koutou katoa. Tō huti mai ki te tātou hui whakanui. Tēnei te mihi a te herenga waka kia koutou, e a kūrangatira, kia tātou e tōnei ka nui tako mihi. Ka nui te honore ki te mihi kia koutou, nō reira, nō mai haere mai ki te whare wānanga. On behalf of the University, a very warm welcome to family and friends, distinguished guests, including Chancellor John Allen and Pro-Chancellor Marianne Street, to members of the senior leadership team, to academic and professional colleagues, students, and our wider community. And that includes members of ministries and departments, our embassies and high commissions, our members of the public sector, and a broad range of other people from other organizations. Welcome everyone to the inaugural lecture of Professor of International Relations, David Capie. I'm Jennifer Windsor, Acting Vice-Chancellor of Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington, and it's a privilege for me tonight to help celebrate David's contributions. David received his first-class Bachelor of Arts honours and Bachelor of Laws here before completing his Masters at the Australian National University and his PhD at York University in Toronto. He returned here in 2004 as lecturer in political science and international relations and has since become a widely recognised expert on New Zealand's foreign policy and conflict and defence issues. He's written and spoken extensively, incisively, and with influence on regional security, on bilateral and multilateral relationships, on arms trafficking and peacekeeping. The significance of David's research and teaching was recognized early in his career. He received our Award for Excellence in Early Career Research in 2007, our Teaching Excellence Award in 2012, and he was nominated for the National Tertiary Teaching Excellence Award in 2013. He's played a key role in establishing a foundational international partnership for the university with the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam through the Master of International Relations. He's more recently forged a strong relationship with the New Zealand Defence Force. Since 2018, we've been privileged to teach NZDF Command and Staff College personnel through the Master of Strategic Studies. Thus, is an all-round scholar, an academic, and engaged public intellectual. It's arguably, though, as Director of the Centre for Strategic Studies that we know Professor David Capie best. Since 2016, he's led the Centre in ways that have raised the international profile of the university, attracting large public and smaller private audiences to hear from key international experts on Asia-Pacific policy and security issues. He's regularly sought out by government, the public sector, and media to provide insight and advice, and he also engages in Track 2 dialogue. Simply put, David is a very significant voice in a very significant area. He's a go-to person who carries that mantle with great professionalism in New Zealand and abroad. New Zealand is a relatively small country. We're involved in a number of multilateral organizations, and we have a tradition of collective security. But now we live in an increasingly hotly contested Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. And in his lecture, David will be talking about an array of very timely issues, with the central one being of the long-time Asia-Pacific era of regional order that's based on the notion of overall cooperation among powers and how this is changing around New Zealand and for New Zealand. And as I think you'll see tonight, David is one of the people to help us look forward across the regional geopolitical landscape to think about what comes next for New Zealand. Ngā mihi nui, kia ora rawa atu, David. Many congratulations on your professorship. And I think we're all really interested to hear what you have to say tonight in your inaugural remarks. Could everyone please help me welcome Professor David Capie to the podium.
E nā mana, e nā reo, e rao rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Wow. Thank you, Jennifer, Vice-Chancellor, for those very that kind introduction, and for all of your encouragement and support over the 7.5 years that you've been here. I couldn't be happier to have you introducing this talk as our Vice-Chancellor. Tēnā koroa, Chancellor and Pro-Chancellor, thank you so much to everybody for being here this evening. It's a real thrill and a genuine pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience, and it's a very humbling experience. An inaugural lecture is a very special sort of university tradition. But it's a very challenging sort of talk to give, because you look out across this in this beautiful chamber, you look out at this room, and you see these multiple different audiences. I look out and I see professional colleagues and experts in the area that I'd like to talk about this evening. I also look out and see some people who probably feel that they're obliged to come along just because they've happened to know me for 30 years. And I also look out now, and it's a sign of just how old and tired I'm getting, that I look out and I see that alongside those people who I've known for 30 years and who came along under some sense of obligation are their children who are here, who are now adults themselves and are probably here under even greater sense of obligation. In fact, I saw one group of children in the audience who I remember very fondly, when they were small, used to tell people that my job was a travel lawyer. And that was because I'd gone to law school with their dad, and all I seemed to do, they thought, was travel. So whatever brought you here, wherever you are here, thanks very much. I'm very grateful to you all for coming along. And I also want to start by saying that I'm very grateful to my mum and dad, that I'm very grateful that they are both able to be here this evening. They were the people that first got me interested in international politics, quizzing me, sitting around the kitchen table as a little boy, asking me about capitals of the world. And it's probably not very well known that my dad was very sick and actually in intensive care when I was waiting for the news to see if I had been promoted. It was a difficult and stressful time, and it wasn't great for Dad either. But the news, when it came, put a smile on his face, so thanks very much to the Professorial Promotions Committee for making the right call. Sally, James and Kate, none of this would be possible without you. Thanks for putting up for all the days that I've been away. The best adventures are the ones we've been on together. And it's also wonderful to have a chance to speak tonight in this very special and wonderful place. And as Jennifer said in her opening remarks, this is a little bit of a homecoming, there's a little bit of circularity in my story, in that back in the 1980s, I started here at Victoria as an undergraduate. And I can tell you then that I would never have imagined in my wildest dreams that I would find myself giving a talk like this tonight. To be honest, I never imagined that I would go on to graduate school, or go on to do a PhD, or go on to have the chance one day to come back and teach with some of the people who had taught me. Those possibilities only happened because of the inspiring teachers I had, the likes of Rod Alley, Stephen Levine, Margaret Clark, and the late Ray Goldstein. It was in their classes, with their encouragement, that I began to think about different ways of trying to understand world politics. And here at Victoria, I also got an education that made me able to imagine different possibilities for my own life. Now tonight, the title of my talk is New Zealand and the End of the Asia-Pacific Era. And as you will hear, I roughly date that era from the late 1980s. And this is what things looked like in the late 1980s. I have to say, I'm not sure what on earth the Australian High Commissioner said to me to do that to my hair, but as you can see from the bottom picture, it also just shows that good hair is wasted on the young. I roughly date the Asia-Pacific era from the late 1980s until fairly recently. And I'm enormously fortunate that my working life, if I can call it that, I can hear some people cackle from the cheap seats, has in a number of ways evolved alongside the development of the Asia-Pacific idea. A huge number of the opportunities that have come my way and puzzles that I've been curious about have come about because of Asia-Pacific cooperation. I've learned a huge amount from colleagues in this room, from conversations with government officials, and perhaps most especially of all from my students. But I think if someone had said to me in 1990 that the region in 2022 would be as important to New Zealand as it is today, that it would look like it looks today, or that it would be changing as it is today, then I think we would have struggled to imagine that. So my talk tonight is in some ways a talk about the challenges of strategic imagination. Now, I must say I ummed and ahed a bit about the title of this talk. I have a bit of trepidation about talking about the end of the Asia-Pacific era. It all sounds very definitive. And these days, frankly, I don't know about you, but to me it feels very hard to be definitive about almost anything in international politics. When I was an undergraduate here, the best-selling book was The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, and it famously and confidently declared the end of ideological conflict and the triumph of liberal democracy. And of course that didn't work out quite so well. And I've also lost track of the number of books and articles that I've come across called The End of War. One of them by John Horgan came out in 2014, just in time to go into paperback for Vladimir Putin's first invasion of Ukraine. So you might think international relations would make me more cautious about reckless, sweeping predictions that can't be easily walked back. But I'm actually feeling pretty confident about the claim I want to make this evening. I'm not very happy about it, but I'm pretty confident. Now, obviously, the Asia-Pacific region has not ended or disappeared. It hasn't gone away. It's not as if countries have moved further apart from one another or stopped interacting, although for a while during COVID, it certainly felt a little bit like that. But the starting point for my talk is that regions are not natural geographic things. They are collections of ideas and practices, the products of our collective imaginations. Regions are a bit like scaled-up versions of what Benedict Anderson called imagined communities. Now, in their talk, their discussion of the origins of security cooperation in Europe and Asia, Christopher Hemmer and Peter Katzenstein give an example of this from the discussions around the origins of the Atlantic Pact in 1948. And when the US Senate began to debate the Atlantic Pact and debate an American security commitment to Europe, Senator Henry Cabot Lodge was puzzled when his colleagues began to refer to the relationship between the United States and Europe or between the United States and North America as a regional one. Surely it can't be a region, he said. What kind of region is that? Of course it can, replied Senator Arthur Vandenberg. We share the same North Atlantic region. And this sparked a debate between the senators about how far this concept of region could be stretched. Did 3,000 miles of ocean make any talk of a common region absurd? Could a region be anything a state wanted it to be? What made up a region beyond some notion of geographic proximity? And this debate sort of reminds us that the fact that regions don't just exist as material objects in the world. As Hemmer and Katzenstein argue, geography is not destiny. Instead, regions are social and cognitive constructs that can strike actors as more or less plausible. And we could make exactly the argument about the Asia-Pacific region and about an Asia-Pacific order. However much this idea of the Asia-Pacific now feels like a familiar part of our lexicon and a familiar part of the way that we think and talk about our part of the world, it is, of course, profoundly artificial. If we look at the membership of APEC, for example, does it make sense that Russia and Peru are part of the same region, or Canada and Brunei are part of the same Asia-Pacific regions? So regions are more than just natural things, they are mental maps. And Canadian Professor Paul Evans says what he calls the frame of the Asia-Pacific was invented in the mid-1980s, largely as a way of capturing the trans-Pacific interest in the growing markets of Asia and trying to find a way to create some sense of community or commonality as an overlay over economic transactions. Now, tonight I'm going to argue there were three aspects to the Asia-Pacific era. The first was an economic dimension. The Asia-Pacific was forged not by governments or militaries, but by firms and businesses pursuing the advantages of globalization. From the 1980s onwards, an outflow of capital from Japan and the United States spurred the rapid industrialization of developing East Asia. This was a period of remarkable regionalization, where production networks within and between firms spread. This was region building from the bottom up, driven by a desire to improve efficiency, reduce costs and make money. And when new government groupings like APEC came along, initially at least, they were playing catch up with business. Liberalisation was the spirit of the times, trade barriers began to fall down, average tariffs in the region fell by a third between 1995 and 2000. Grand dreams began to be dreamed. APEC itself set itself the vision of a free trade area and investment zone across the whole Asia-Pacific by 2020. Now, to be clear, none of this was inevitable and none of it was linear. There were zigs and zags, most notably the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, which posed huge questions about the role of the United States and the international financial institutions in Asia's future. There were still plenty of protectionists out there. There were efforts like Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir's efforts to create an East Asian economic group that would exclude Australia, New Zealand and the United States. But these efforts failed, and overall this was the story of a trans-Pacific economic region coming together. And that takes us to the second part of the Asia-Pacific order, its security dimension. The Asia-Pacific era emerged at the end of the Cold War and flourished in what we can now look back on as a remarkable unipolar moment. Its main feature was the American predominance of power, in which in Asia manifests itself in its hub and spokes alliance system. Now, although there was a debate at the end of the Cold War about the US withdrawing from the region, those alliances remain pivotal, remain central to regional security today. They also evolved. The US-Australia alliance, for example, in the early 2000s began to be framed much more about contributing to US global security goals, fighting terrorism, and providing public goods like humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. But under US preeminence, there was also a space for other ideas, even if sometimes they were aspirational. Some of these initially emerged from the European context and were a poor fit for the different strategic circumstances of East Asia. And as scholars like Amitav Acharya and Brian Jobe have written, it took the work of Asia's Track 2 networks, academics and think tankers to translate or localize them into concepts and initiatives where they resonated in Asia. One was the idea of cooperative security that took hold among Southeast Asian thinkers in the 1990s. This was the idea that countries would seek to build security with one another rather than at one another's expense. It was gradualist. It believes in habits of cooperation and dialogue. And again, to be clear, these were never adopted in a way that transformed the most fundamental national interests, but they did provide space for the development of cooperation and diplomacy, defense diplomacy, on a rich series of issues. Another key idea was the principle of engagement that underpinned US-China relations. And when Paul Evans and I wrote a book on the language of regional security in the Asia-Pacific, we were struck by the sheer number of these terms for engagement: conditional engagement, constructive engagement, partial engagement, hawk engagement. What they all had in common was this idea that in dealing with a rising power like China, required finding ways to accommodate its interests within the existing order. The hope was that through engagement, through carrots and sticks, it would buy into the key understandings of the regional order. And it's sort of hard to remember in these much more confrontational times, but that era of engagement went on for a lot longer than I think we tend to remember these days. And just to give you one example, the first invitation to the People's Liberation Army Navy, China's Navy, to take part in the biggest US military exercise in the Pacific came in 2014. Now finally, the third part of this Asia-Pacific era, this Asia-Pacific order, and one that was especially valuable for New Zealand, was its diplomatic component. And looking back, it's hard to believe that in the early 1990s, Asia was described by one leading scholar as being ripe for rivalry and prone to conflict because it lacked sufficient multilateral institutions. What we saw from the 1990s onwards was a remarkable period of institution building, and more than that, inclusive institution building. There are a number of special features of Asia's regionalism. These organizations were not created by the big powers. Instead, they were founded around the smaller and weaker powers of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. They differed from their European counterparts by virtue of being based on norms of consensus, informality, building habits of cooperation, putting issues aside when things got too difficult. And the mantra that grew up around these groups was the claim of ASEAN centrality, that ASEAN was in the driver's seat, that the weaker states in Asia were the focus for cooperation. And the creation of the ASEAN Regional Forum in 1994 was seen as a key way to engage China, which at the time was very wary about containment strategies in disguise. The US was also very sceptical about these new groupings, calling proposals solutions in search of a problem, but it eventually began to see them as useful as well. The growth continued. Prime ministers and presidents started meeting at the East Asia Summit in 2005. In 2011, defence ministers were the final part of the puzzle when they met in the defence ministers' process. Now, some have rather grandly called this a regional security architecture. And I have to say, if it was architecture, I think it is more Hunderwasser's toilet than it is Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. I think you have to do I don't think too many architects would be rushing to sign up to claim this as a very impressive, tidy piece of work. But there was certainly a structure to it and a tempo of regular meetings. And for the most enthusiastic, these were sites where processes of socialization could occur, where new norms could emerge. For others, they were at least places where officials could talk, could share their fears and ambitions, and in theory work to forge a better region. Now, together, I argue these three elements, economic, security, and diplomatic, made up an Asia-Pacific order. Not one that sits easily in any one basket of international theory. There's a mix of realist alliances as well as liberal economic interdependence and inclusive institutions. And that's not even to acknowledge the changes that took place inside states as the era of state-making came to an end, and most of the post-colonial boundaries in Asia were accepted. Now, this was not an uncontested era, let's be clear about that. The commitment to economic liberalisation rarely lived up to the rhetoric. Domestic politics frequently trumped, no pun intended, regional declarations. China constantly bemoaned the Cold War mentality of US alliances, and engagement as a strategy within the US itself had plenty of critics. There were efforts to challenge ASEAN centrality, and one of the most memorable was Kevin Rudd's idea for a new regional summit called the Asia-Pacific Community, which Mr. Rudd announced before talking to anyone else in the region about it. And this at least provided an opportunity for some of us to go to Sydney to watch Australians being shouted at by Singaporeans. There were these challenges, but they didn't prevail. And this brings me to my second major argument, and this was an order and era that was incredibly kind to New Zealand. New Zealand found itself on the edge of the most dynamic part of the global economy. Pursuing an Asia-first trade policy from 1993 onwards, it saw plurilateral and other regional free trade agreements to work around the lack of consensus in the GATT and the WTO. We saw the proliferation of those trade agreements, and we know so many on that list. And as Ian McGibbon details in his excellent new history of the Foreign Ministry, New Zealand excelled in the business of trade negotiations. In terms of security, New Zealand enjoyed the shelter provided by US predominance and the fact that our large and only ally lay between us and some of the challenges of the region as it changed. And that meant that in March 2001, Helen Clark could tell a conference here in Wellington that, quote, "We count ourselves very lucky to live in one of the most strategically secure environments in the world," going on to say that this was the context in which her government was able to champion disarmament objectives. New Zealand was able to use cooperative security approaches to push for progress in Asia on non-traditional issues. For example, transnational crime, maritime security, counter-terrorism, disaster reduction and peacekeeping. And it was this sort of time that took me down a slightly unexpected pathway of research into research on arms trafficking in Asia and the Pacific. And I have to say I enjoyed the work, found it very interesting. But it must be said that when the arrival of magazines like Guns and Ammo and Jane's infantry weapons started to arrive through the letterbox, it did briefly strain my marriage somewhat. And when it came to those diplomatic groupings, New Zealand was what one official called a compulsive joiner. We were quick to seek membership in all of the wider ASEAN groupings. In his account of ASEAN-New Zealand relations, Malcolm McKinnon argues that for New Zealand, the formation of the ASEAN Regional Forum was a key moment in transforming its relationship with ASEAN from a focus on Southeast Asia into a wider regional one. When the opportunity came to join the East Asia Summit with Australia and India, Helen Clark jumped at the chance. We looked and led at opportunities in the defence minister's space. And we even signed up to something called the Asia-Europe meeting, or ASEM, a sprawling trans-regional gabfest that quickly revealed itself as unable to do very much. Now, to be fair, New Zealand only signed up, pushed to join when Australia announced it wanted in. Better to be on the inside looking out than stuck out in the cold. And in 1993, the New Zealand government decided to create a new centre to support that engagement with the emerging Asian multilateralism. The Centre for Strategic Studies was headed up by Terence O'Brien, and its first staff member, co-opted from a very brief spell outside the safety of the university, was one D. Capie. I was quickly back to graduate study where I was the sheltered workshop of the university. Even as others grew more sceptical about regional architecture, New Zealand always seemed to be a true believer. It seemed to sort of sit something deep down in our DNA that if you could dialogue enough, if you could korero enough, you can find a compromise and a solution. And it was really interesting to me that just over 18 months ago, Foreign Minister Mahuta, when she was asked if there were prospects for mediating between the US and China, she said, I think hosting APEC might well be the opportunity, but both parties will have to be willing to come together and concede in some areas where they're currently not seeing eye to eye. So why then do I argue that this era has come to an end? First, in terms of in the economic dimension, there are good reasons to think that the high watermark of the globalizing revolution has come and gone. Trade as a percentage of global GDP has declined in the last few years, even prior to the disruptions of COVID and the war in Ukraine. Protectionism is on the rise. The United States has taken a dramatically sharp turn on trade policy. President Trump famously walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but President Biden's trade policy for the middle class doesn't look very different. The US's new economic strategy for the region, the so-called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, doesn't see as part of the exchange any improved market access to the United States. There's no political constituency in the US today that's arguing in favour of these big multilateral trade deals. New economic connections are grounded increasingly in relationships of trust and geopolitical alignment, not economic efficiency. And it's not just the US that has turned more inwards. China's doing the same through its new idea of dual circulation economic model and its zero COVID strategy. That shift has probably been given additional spurs as China reacts to what it sees as the risks in interdependence in the global financial system following the imposition of sanctions on Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. India has also turned inwards with Prime Minister Modi's call for greater self-reliance. So rather than a language of closer integration, we now hear about decoupling. Rather than trade underpinning peace, some of the fiercest competition has been in the areas of trade and technology. Trade has been used as a blunt instrument of coercion. In an era of strategic competition, war and pandemics, those long supply chains cry out vulnerability. Secondly, though, it's in the dimension of security where the biggest changes have happened. And China's power has grown in a way that would have been hard to imagine even for the most far-sighted observer 30 years ago. China now has the largest navy in the world, an estimated 355 vessels compared to the US's 296, and it's building more. Everybody has a China factoid they like to wheel out at cocktail parties, or perhaps that's maybe a sad reflection on the cocktail parties I'm going to. But here's one. Between 2014 and 2018, China launched more submarines, warships, amphibious vessels and auxiliaries than the number of ships currently serving in the navies of Germany, India, Spain and the UK. A German admiral noted in 2021 that China's navy is expanding roughly the equivalent of the entire French navy every 4 years. It's investing enormous amounts in advanced technologies, and its defence budget remains smaller than that of the United States. Its military remains untested, it has few formal allies, but China has a big advantage in our region it's playing on home turf. And so the military balance of power in the region has shifted fundamentally. That itself would have been a challenge, but China's behaviour has also changed. China's charm offensive in Southeast Asia ended more than a decade ago. Its actions in the South China Sea and the East China Sea on its regional border with India collectively suggest a state that wants to change the regional status quo. The result is that power politics and hard balancing are back. Last May, the White House's Indo-Pacific leader, Kurt Campbell, put it clearly when he said, quote, "The period that was broadly described as engagement has come to an end." And both the United States and China now frequently talk about each other as adversaries, if not as enemies. And when it comes to the return of power politics, it's not just about the United States and China. Japan has talked about increasing its defence spending to about 2% of GDP, which will make it the third largest defence budget in the world. Under its Strategic Update 2020, Australia planned to spend an astonishing $270 billion in new spending on top of our already large defence budget over the next decade. And the third area where I think the Asia-Pacific era is coming to an end is perhaps maybe this is the more debatable one, and that is that the cooperative arrangements that have emerged over the last 25 years are struggling to cope with the pressures of much sharper great power relations. ASEAN is today stressed by internal struggles like Myanmar and extra-regional pressures. And even in softer areas where it can actually talk about issues, it's hard to turn commitments on paper into action on the ground. Now, these criticisms are not new, and it's not as if New Zealand officials aren't aware of the limitations of some of these arrangements. And I'm not saying that these processes have no value, especially for a small country. But I think what's different this time is that we are seeing the rise of alternative frameworks of cooperation. And the most important of these are the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, that brings together Australia, India, Japan and the United States. Another is AUKUS, the relationship between Australia, the UK and the US, launched last September. But there's also a host of other trilateral arrangements as well. And these mini-lateral arrangements, as they're sometimes called, are not new, but the intensity of strategic competition that's going on has led US allies and partners to invest more in these mini-laterals than in the larger inclusive frameworks. And President Biden, just in the last day or so, has announced that he won't be going to the APEC summit in Thailand this year. But just as a point of contrast, the 4 Quad leaders have met twice in person and once virtually in the last 12 months. And it's not just the US and its allies that are creating new institutions. China has been doing the same. For example, in the Mekong, it's been deepening its connections through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And these raise questions about the performance and adequacy of the existing cooperative frameworks. And perhaps these minilateral frameworks didn't matter so much when they were just tackling these harder security issues. But as they start to take on more and more issues, climate change, emerging technology, artificial intelligence, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, the costs of not being in the room, the costs of not engaging with those groups becomes higher and higher as new rules and new standards are being set. We still hear the invocation of ASEAN centrality. We hear it over and over, but I would argue that unfortunately very few of those who profess to support it really believe it. It's not going to end tomorrow, but I do think it's going to be less important in substantive terms. So across all these dimensions, economic, security, diplomatic, a period of relative stability and predictability has come to an end. And collectively, I think that marks the end of the Asia-Pacific era. Now, if I'm right, it obviously begs the question, what's next? Now, one answer might be that the Asia-Pacific era has given way to the Indo-Pacific. Certainly, the language of the Indo-Pacific is all around us. Australia has used the term in its foreign defence policy since at least 2013. Former Japanese Prime Minister Abe talked about a vision of free and open Indo-Pacific, terminology that was picked up by the United States. The US even renamed its Pacific Command Indo-Pacific Command in 2018, even though it continued to cover precisely the same area of the world as it had before. The EU has joined the fray. The Netherlands has an Indo-Pacific strategy. France does as well. And just about a year ago, Prime Minister Ardern put New Zealand's stamp on the Indo-Pacific just down the road from here in a speech where she laid out not a strategy, not a policy, but a series of principles that New Zealand believes in guiding its approach to Indo-Pacific. Principles like the importance of sovereignty, transparency, international law, but also, and she was clear to stress this, the importance of inclusivity and not drawing frames that pushed some out of the region. So what can we say about the origins of the Indo-Pacific? My colleague Manjit Pardisi has written that it's actually nothing new, that really we're returning to the Indo-Pacific idea, that a single strategic region connecting the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean has been the norm, except for a short period since the 1960s. One thing is for sure, if the Asia-Pacific was created by business, the Indo-Pacific is being driven by geopolitics. But if this frame seems to be spreading, if the language seems to be catching on, I'd argue the economic, the military, the institutional content of this new order is still far from clear. And if we look at the way that Asia has responded to the war in Ukraine, it should perhaps remind us that we're unlikely to see neat alignments emerging, that rather we're going to see big players calculating and pursuing their interests. Sometimes these will align, sometimes they won't. Whatever we think of China and Beijing's behaviour under Xi Jinping, it will remain a vital economic partner for many and an influential political actor. And there are plenty of countries in our part of the world that even if they harbour concerns about Beijing's policies, will be reluctant to sign up to frameworks that exclude it. What I think we're likely to see, unfortunately, is something messier, much less predictable, much more dangerous than we've enjoyed for the last 30 years. And in a recent article, the Indian scholar and former National Security Advisor, Shashank Menon, says, he says, we live in an era with a world of revisionist powers. No one likes the current world order, he says. No single power can dictate the terms of the current order, and the major powers do not subscribe to a clear set of principles and norms. It's hard to establish the rules of the road when so many countries are on their own paths. In the words of the great Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci, the old order is dying and the new order cannot be born. So we need to prepare for challenging times ahead, a region that is more conflictual, less open, and without the comfort of multilateral institutions that New Zealand has always looked to. But that sounds like a fairly bleak picture, and Sally said to me, make sure you try and finish on a slightly upbeat note. Perhaps it also presents some opportunities for small and middle powers to imagine and to try and reshape the emerging order. And I appreciate this has got a bit of a sort of apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play, sort of tone about it. New Zealand was hugely skillful at innovating on the economics and trade front during the Asia-Pacific era. Can we do something the same in a modest way for this new in geopolitics and for the new era that's coming next? This might take us into some uncomfortable territory. Power is a bit of a dirty word in the New Zealand lexicon. You will search all of our defence statements in vain for any reference to our own power. We only ever talk about other people's power. Certainly, the government seems most comfortable in framing its foreign policy ventures as trade missions. We could ask some questions about whether or not we're putting sufficient resourcing into our diplomacy and our defence. We could ask hard questions about the sort of relationships we might want to have with AUKUS or the Quad, these new exclusive frameworks. But perhaps there are also some signs that we're seeing small states are already able, in modest ways, to shape the behaviour of big powers in ways that are emerging. And I'm thinking here of the new US-led Partners for the Blue Pacific. And if we think about the way that it has approached the challenge of strategic competition in the South Pacific, it has done so by focusing on the priorities and concerns of Pacific Island states. It's learned that it's better to talk about climate change, development and opportunities than China, China, China. Now, a pivot from trade to security in the way that New Zealand thinks about its priorities might not be easy, and it won't be welcomed by all, but perhaps it is what the times require. And indeed, it might be coming sooner than we think. And I stumbled on an OIA the other day. A few people suddenly go, uh-oh, in the room. An OIA that was released to a website. I didn't request it, I can say, of a briefing before the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore to Minister Pine Henare, Defence Minister. And it was only popped up on the web about 10 days ago, and I just stumbled across it. And it had a whole section on the Indo-Pacific concept. And this was the advice that was in that briefing. It said, in 2022, the term Asia-Pacific no longer captures adequately the full span of New Zealand's interests, our economic and strategic partnerships. It has become increasingly seen as an economic construct, promoting regional trade and economic integration. How times have changed. So finally, if I can return to where I started, I'd say in closing, as we think about this new terrain that we're encountering, there's a vital role for universities, and I hope a vital role for Victoria University of Wellington. Whatever emerges to replace the predictability, the relative predictability of the Asia-Pacific era, we need to be able to try and make sense of it through a New Zealand lens. As China, India, Indonesia and others become much bigger players in our region and our world in the years ahead, we need the expertise in languages and cultures, in government, in society, in history, in economies, to help us understand how others see the world and see the region changing around us. And if we don't have our own experts, we'll find ourselves relying on the assessments of others. And however like-minded they might be, they will not always have the same priorities and interests that we do. So I think it's vital that we continue to invest in these areas in our universities and encourage the next generation of researchers to come through. And in an era in which there will be few certainties, I think it's also essential that we're able to think for ourselves, to question, to critique, and to debate. And I'd like to think that that is one of the things that universities are very good at doing. And I hope Victoria can continue to be part of the conversations here in Wellington as we imagine about how best to secure New Zealand's interests and how a better regional order can be built in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko ingarangi me wera me whakapaparanga mai, ke pone ke te kāinga. Ko te amo aranui aho, ki te herenga waka, ko Diana Burton aho. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Good evening and welcome. My name is Diana Burton. I am the Acting Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. And before we all let David loose and give him a drink, it is my very great pleasure to offer the vote of thanks. Felix qui potuit rerum conoscere causus. Happy, the Roman poet Virgil tells us, is the individual who is capable of understanding the causes of things. This evening, after such a penetrating lecture as we have just heard, we are each of us abler and happier than we were before. Or perhaps not happier. David has shown clearly how our construction of the Asia-Pacific region as a mostly beneficial, or if not, or at least benign space in which we could benefit in terms of security, trade, the economy and foreign policy can no longer stand, at least not in the same way as it has before. Times change, and whether we like it or not, our posture in the region and the world changes with them. David makes it clear how we're in danger of being left out if we remain complacent or lazy, if we seek to retain our place at the table, if we want to thrive as an independent society, and surely we do, we will need to rethink our thinking quite radically. In some ways, this means reassessing and reforming the boxes that we invented for ourselves. In others, it means embracing the intellectual values of the university. Languages, cultural studies and global thinking could be crucial to our regional success, however we denominate it or define it. It's fortunate then, perhaps even a prompt to happiness, that we have minds like David's to help us formulate our fresh approach. Indeed, it's a source of pleasure when we have an opportunity to appreciate how our colleagues and our friends are not merely eminent, but deservedly eminent, because they're smart. This lecture has drawn on a remarkably varied range of material. Not everyone can fold together economic ideas, competing national trade practices, the fabric of international diplomacy, and geopolitical realities, and make something meaningful out of all of it. Most of us are familiar, even if only superficially, with the bits and pieces of David's lecture. But rendering such disparate kinds of information and scholarship into a picture so clear and coherent is a rare ability. And to do the job with ease and elegance excites, let's not say envy, but certainly admiration. I was fascinated in hearing David first analyse our current political situation and then fit the parts together in a way that casts new light on the whole and makes us all reconsider what we thought we already knew. This is a talk that's much greater than the sum of its parts, for which we are all very grateful. Thank you.